Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by ROOST Real Estate Company, Property Management. To learn more about the services we provide, visit investwithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where it's our mission to create and coach business opportunities and strategies that support residential real estate investors. I'm Chris McAllister, and I'm here today with my marketing partner, Lacey LeBlanc, and our Director of Property Management, Gretchen Mitchell. Good morning, ladies.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today, we're going to talk about probably nobody's favorite thing. We're going to talk about metrics. We're going to talk about numbers, and specifically, we're going to talk about the metrics that our property management team here at ROOST Real Estate Company use to track and manage our business on a monthly, weekly, in some cases, it's a daily basis. And I don't want to just talk about the metrics that look good on a dashboard or in a social media post. You know, we're going to talk about metrics that actually drive landlord profitability. And in our experience, property management companies that track, what I've seen is, and I don't mean this to sound mean or catty or anything, but a lot of property management companies track metrics that are easy, right? That are actually easy to find the numbers for, that are easy to track. And it's not necessarily that they're tracking the metrics that matter. And in so many cases, many of us, and we've been down this road too, we track the metrics that our software vendors tell us that we're supposed to track. And that may or may not be relevant to what, is going to enhance owner profitability at all. And a lot of traditional metrics that property management industry uses, they sort of lump everything together. And the fact is, owner decisions, portfolio strategy, market cycles, timing, a lot of times these traditional metrics just sort of treat everything the same, and there's no nuance for what's actually happening. And often that result is you got information that looks pretty cool, looks precise, looks great in a social media post, but it's often not useful. And bad information like that, or less than useful information, often leads to poor decisions or no decisions being made at all when, some tough decisions actually need to be made. So I like to think, and Gretchen, you're going to help me prove this thesis, is that we've taken a different approach at our company. We track metrics that reflect reality. I'd like to think it's not fantasy. And more importantly, we strive to constantly be tracking metrics that directly shape the daily work of our team so that we are doing the right things that affect positively, that give our owners, positive outcomes and more profitability. So that's a whole lot of word salad, and I apologize for that. But we are going to go kind of deep today, and we'll see how that goes. So any first thoughts on this, ladies?
Well, it sounds like I might be the only one who's excited about this, but data and metrics and spreadsheets and pivot tables and all the things are what gives me life. That's, like you said, how we make all of our decisions. Gretchen, you have any initial thoughts before we dig in?
I think I'm really excited to talk about mostly the things that a lot of owners think matters, but really dive deeper into it so that they understand more of the bigger picture.
Yeah, that's a great way to start. So before we get into the individual metrics that we track, can we talk about what we mean by metrics in the context of property management?
Well, when we talk about metrics, from a business context, is we're talking about measurements that guide decisions and behavior. So good metrics, they tell the truth about what's happening, and they help focus the team's attention on the work that actually needs to get done, right? We're not talking about metrics that make any particular person certainly look good or bad, but great metrics actually, at the end of the day, they create clarity. And that clarity can result in a picture that maybe not as good as we'd like from time to time. But again, you can't fix anything that you can't measure. And if you don't measure it, you don't have a chance. So that's kind of in a nutshell the Webster's definition of metrics.
Metrics equal truth is where, like, that's my simplification. The metrics are the truth about what's happening, regardless of how, we feel or how it may look anecdotally, or, again, those pretty graphs that we see on social media. Metrics are the truth. So two terms that come up a lot when we're talking, particularly to owners, but also to, vendors and software producers, is owner churn and unit churn. Can you explain the difference in those and how we look at them?
Owner churn is honestly, I think, Gretchen, you would agree, it's the most important metric that we watch. We've got a spreadsheet where we show, all of our, the number of owners we have, where we have owners, we track how many doors owners have. I mean, there's a lot of things that we track internally to help us run our business, but owner churn is the most important at Roost because it's about relationship. So owner churn measures how many owners start or end their relationship with us or with any property management company over a given period of time, right? So, we may just decide that we're going to track that for all of 2026 and with the idea that we're going to compare that to whatever happened in 2025, right? So we're checking ourselves against past performance so that we have a benchmark so we can get better. But owner churn is interesting because owners, may leave a company for a lot of different reasons, right? Sometimes, let me just say this, my anxiety goes through the roof anytime we lose an owner, right? And in turn, Gretchen feels it, everybody feels it. We just don't like to lose an owner, right? We've had owners that have been with us for 10 plus years, and that's the greatest thing that you can have in a business like this. But the fact is, we shouldn't beat ourselves up for owners leaving as often as I beat us up for it. But they leave for a lot of reasons. Maybe they're retiring. Maybe they need to rebalance their portfolio. Maybe they've got a particular property that has just always been a problem for them for whatever reason, and it makes sense to sell it. Maybe they're upgrading their properties. Maybe they've got, 3 or 4 single family houses and they want to turn those into a down payment on a small apartment building. Sometimes it's estate planning, and then God forbid people die, right? There's a lot of things that that fall into that owner churn number that don't have really anything to do with the management company's performance, right? The only time owner churn becomes a problem is when we let them down, right? When somebody leaves because their expectations weren't met. So you got to track it, right? So the first one is owner churn, where we talk about churning relationships. And the second big number that you hear a lot about, and this is a critical number for us as well, it's unit churn. So sometimes unit churn or door churn is simply about the property, and it is the property, right? So door churn is about how many units are added or removed from management over the course of a given period of time. And units can come and go even when the owner relationship stays intact. And that's especially, common for owners with larger portfolios. So, you'll hear a lot of property management companies talk about, their churn is very, very low and so forth. And that very well may be the case, but what you don't understand in that number is, regardless of how big or small the number is, how much of that churn was about the positive experience that the owner was experiencing with that company, right? An owner is going to reposition their portfolio, buy more, trade up, whatever, if they're making money and if they feel good about their property management relationship. So again, we track both. We track owner churn because relationships are the business, and we track the unit churn, the door churn, because those properties are the assets that are within those relationships. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we
Absolutely.
track both, and we track the context around both, right?
Right.
So again, owner churn, both of these, owner churn, unit churn, I think imply they have a negative connotation, right? But that's just not always the case. I think that's a really important distinction to make. Gretchen, I think this one's for you because you mentioned it right at the beginning, but let's talk about why the wrong metrics can be damaging. So what is the danger for landlords and investors specifically when they are relying on the wrong metrics?
So sometimes they can be focusing on the wrong things if they do this. A lot of times owners will chase occupancy instead of cash flow. They pressure managers on the vacancy. Sometimes it's outside of the manager's control, whether it's the time of year, whatever it may be. But over time, it will lead to frustration. But we try to show owners the bigger picture of their portfolio. Yes, this is vacant, but hey, we got this person to sign a renewal and we increased the rent for you. And we are advertising this one. So if they do only focus on the vacant unit, sometimes they can neglect other things that are going on in their portfolio. Sometimes it's really their main focus.
I mean, a bad number, a bad metric can cause you to focus on things that aren't going to improve your overall profitability.
Right.
Now, granted, we're talking about owners that have, tend to have more than one property, but nevertheless, depending on what you're focusing on, obviously a vacancy can be caused by a lot of different things, including an owner decision, right? Whereas when it comes down to actually collecting rent and making sure that property performs over the course of the lease period and beyond, I think that's far more of the manager's, the manager can affect that, right? The tenant relations can affect that. But, as an owner out there, when you are focusing on, quote, the wrong metrics, you run the risk of it demoralizes the property manager because I have yet to meet a property manager who isn't doing the best they can. But when they're playing a game that they can't win, and there's rules that just flat out don't apply to this situation, I think it's why we actually see as much churn amongst property managers in our business as we do amongst owners and doors.
Yeah, how does that relate to how we think about churn at Roost?
We are always willing to be measured on churn, right? As long as it's attributed properly. And I want to define churn. I want to get it out there in the world, but I also don't want to come off as overly defensive either. We fully own churn caused by mistakes, dissatisfaction, owner alignment, right? Misalignment. Even if it turns out that we're not well aligned either early on or several weeks, months, years on with an owner, we still own that, right? We're the ones that signed that PMA, as much as the owner did. And so we will fully own churn caused by, anything that we do wrong, we'll fall on our sword, we'll admit it in public. We're very transparent in that regard, probably more so than honestly that we should be. But we don't believe it's fair or useful, to treat portfolio sales or planned exits as failures. And that gets back to the whole difference between door churn, unit churn, and owner churn. It's crushing for us to lose an owner. We do value the relationship. We want to do the best we can for them, but sometimes things happen. But it's not something we take lightly.
I feel like it's kind of like measuring the performance of like a funeral home based on churn, right? If that's part of the plan all along. If it's built in, I mean, we help people manage their portfolios, right? We help people see that with their futures. This is not just about property management. Roost prides itself on portfolio management. So eventually that person, if they want to retire, if they want to move, if they want to pass it on, eventually that portfolio, there is going to be a planned exit. So if that's part of the service, then I can see how we don't want to attribute that as a failure. We want to see it as a success. So,
that's interesting that you brought that up. And this is an aside that, we'll get into probably in another podcast episode, but the end goals, right? What a portfolio owner, somebody that may have 20, 30, 40, 50, 150 properties, what their exit strategy is, what their end game looks like, what they want to have that portfolio be maximized for over the next 5 to 10 years is night and day from what, a single unit owner or somebody who has a handful of properties is. And again, that gets back to how, we set up different metrics. We hold ourselves accountable for different metrics for single unit owners than we do for portfolio type owners. So I guess what it comes down to is one size does not fit all at the end of the day.
So that pretty much sums up Roost in general, that we're operating for shared success. We're not just saying, like, we could push portfolio owners to hold on to their properties if that's not aligned with their long-term goals, then
No,
we're not doing our job, right? So
that's exactly right. Whatever their long-term goals are, that's what we're charged with helping to facilitate. And if somebody comes to us with goals that, we can't help, don't know how to help, then that's probably, somebody that's not a good fit for us, and we're not a good fit for them. So we just have to make sure that we are absolutely aligned with whatever that individual owner's goals are.
So while we are managing their property, we talk a lot about vacancy and vacancy rates and occupancy rates. Before we talk about kind of those as metrics, can you define for us how vacancy and occupancy are actually calculated?
All right, here's a little bit more arithmetic, right? So vacancy and occupancy are pretty simple when it's all said and done, but they're often applied in ways that create a lot of confusion. So vacancy percentage or vacancy rate is the percentage of units that are currently not occupied, whereas occupancy is the inverse of that. It's the percentage of units that are occupied. So if you have 100 units under management, 90 of them are occupied, you're at 90% occupancy, right? The problem isn't the math. The problem is which is it, the numerator or denominator? I guess it's the number that's in the denominator. So most traditional calculations include every unit under management, regardless of whether that unit is available to lease or not, right? And this is where we get into the difference between occupancy or vacancy and rent collected. But so traditionally, a lot of times these metrics, they factor in things that, again, are beyond the control of, if not the manager, the owner as well. So units that are under rehab or units that are intentionally held vacant or awaiting owner decisions or being repositioned. Again, traditionally, all of these things that may be happening within an individual owner's home or group of homes traditionally get lumped into a big number that the property manager is supposed to own, right? And often that number looks really precise, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the property management's performance. So, when you're out there interviewing property management companies, I just hope that you kind of keep this in mind, and hopefully this whole thing helps you ask the right question. We focus on vacancy and occupancy for units that are actually available to lease, right? That keeps the metric tied to what our team, the leasing team, the management team, can actually influence and what matters operationally. When we work with owners who have multiple properties, we'll compare vacancy rates within their portfolio against similar portfolio and company-wide trends. But you're never going to see us put one giant number out there celebrating the fact that at this one moment in time, we were at 99% occupancy or 0.1% vacancy, I guess. I feel like I'm making this a little bit too complicated as I start to talk through it, but it's something that it matters to us, it matters to our owners, and I just think it's important that we get how we think about this out there in the world.
I think this is one of those that somebody could argue, right? That, well, tracking it this way, right? The way Roost does it, could make it look better than it is. But I think the context is important when you place the emphasis on the fact that we're making decisions based on these numbers, and just like comparing vacancy rates from portfolio to portfolio, that's hugely valuable for the owner, because then you can see, okay, is there something going on in this portfolio that's not happening in the other, that's either improving or, reducing our vacancy rates? I think that's really important. So talk to me more about why that distinction matters so much for the owners when you talk about vacancy and occupancy.
I honestly think it comes down to that when you don't have context and you're focusing on just one number, it just can lead to bad conclusions that in turn lead to bad decisions, or again, no decisions at all. You may have a number, for one set of owners or something that may reflect a problem, right? Or it may not. So again, context is everything. And then to take that number as the be all end all and start to pressure managers on that outcome, I guarantee you that manager will start managing for that number. And there's a good chance that managing for that number is not going to be the what you want them focused on if you're interested in long-term profitability and an appreciating asset. Vacancy should tell a story, I think, more so about leasing performance and tenant retention. And it's just really easy to get that all messed up and lumped in with, various owners' portfolio strategies or timing or, whatever that is. Again, context, I think, is the best word here.
So we also track days on market in a very specific way. Gretchen, talk to me about how we define days on market and why we do it that way.
I really like the way we do this. So days on market is just what it sounds like, how many days it's been on the market. But days on market, it's actually what's available for rent. So the clock starts when a unit is truly rent ready and available for leasing, not when it becomes just vacant. But we're not going to count the time it takes to turn it, waiting decisions from an owner or a contractor. It's actually when it's rent ready, ready to be moved in, put out there for everyone to view. We start the clock then, and then at 21 days, we have to maybe reevaluate things. If it's not rented in 21 days, do we need to go look at it? Do we need to talk about a price reduction? Do we need to think about a move-in special? But 21 days is kind of our mark of, hey, this isn't renting, what's going on, and how can we get this rented sooner?
Yeah, and I think it's fair to, this is probably the most unambiguous metric I think that we look at every weekly meeting that Gretchen has with the team. Everybody's got a copy of the report from Tenant Turner, and she and her team go down the list one by one. What's happening with this one? What's happening with this one? What's happening with this one? And I embarrassed to say I don't know what our actual average is on what the report looks like this week. It does seem that this holiday season was probably a little weaker than the last 2 or 3 holiday seasons have been for us, and January isn't as quick. I think as a rule, we're usually in there, once a sign goes, in the window or, hits the website. I'm going to guess here, we have to go back and verify this, but it's probably 11 to 14 days. And that's why we really start to get a little nervous between 14 and 21 days. And that's the beauty of actually having that meeting every Thursday. But it does feel like it's a little bit softer, these first few weeks of 2026. But as in every year, we've got high hopes for tax return season. So for us, February, March, and April are usually fantastic leasing months. So hopefully our owners and we're all well positioned to take advantage of that as it comes up here.
Yeah, is there anything else that days on market tells you operationally? We've talked about what happens if within 21 days, it's not rented. What else does it tell you kind of operationally about how we're promoting or marketing a property?
We use Tenant Turner as our leasing platform. And it's interesting. Tenant Turner is a system, right? And honestly, our leasing manager's job is to make sure that system runs flawlessly. Where I think the property manager, the local property manager, whether it's Taylor or Tina or Gretchen having to get involved, is when that system is working beautifully and we're hitting that 14 to 21 day period and we still haven't surfaced a qualified applicant, right? So operationally, that report tells us if the system is working, if our workflows are adequate, if things are going to plan. But at the end of the day, what we're looking for is the exception. And for us, that exception is, damn it, what happened? If we haven't hit that 14, day mark, what do we need to do? Is the sign up? Recheck the listing, on Zillow and every place else, and take another walk through the property and call the people who have scheduled showings and get their feedback if they didn't already give us feedback, right? If nothing else, that triggers a conversation. But like Gretchen said, we come back to review again, pricing, condition. Are the photos any good, right? Is it the time of year? There's a lot of different things, but that goes back to we have to use these metrics as a way to drill down to the individual door. That's the issue. And that we believe is the best way to use metrics and work metrics, is to actually use them to figure out what the exception is so we can fix it.
Yeah, and big picture wise, right? It tells you a lot about kind of the current market conditions. So if you start to see trends there, markets change constantly. Normally it's slow, right? And so you kind of have your finger on the pulse. But I feel like, when these things start to change, when you start to see more trends, that can really help keep your finger on the pulse of the market condition, the market itself, when it comes to rentals as well.
We're doing some other things too to sort of enhance the whole experience. We're starting to use a company called Planomatic to get professional pictures taken on all of our listings and so forth. And I guess I think that's really cool. I think it's in great service to the owners. It's in great service to the prospective applicants. It's more transparent. It tells a better story, et cetera, et cetera. But I have no illusions that Planomatic is suddenly going to make everything rent 7 days faster
Right.
on average. No matter how well we improve, the marketing or, the showcasing of individual properties for rent, at the end of the day, it still comes down to managing that leasing process, having that partnership with the owner, where we can have an honest conversation about what the, current rent rates are, how that house stacks up to the neighborhood standards, et cetera. The metric's important. It forces us to drill down, but at the end of the day, it's what we do as a team to get that property rented that matters. Nothing else does.
Yeah, you're going to know. Roost is going to know if adding better pictures magically improves or speeds up the rental process, right? Not counting on it, but if it happens, I take comfort in the fact that as a property management company, you're going to know because you keep an eye on this every single week. You have a meeting. So we talked about days on market doesn't include time to turn. So let's define time to turn and talk about what that includes.
Gretchen, you take this one, huh?
The time to turn is the period between a tenant moving out to being rent ready again. So that includes the initial walkthrough and inspection, the lock change, getting the scope, talking with contractors, getting it all approved, and then getting the work actually done. So it does sometimes take a while to turn. You would be surprised that the size of the scope does matter. Contractor availability always matters, getting it scheduled. Sometimes we can do it in-house. Sometimes we do have to contract it out. A lot of times owners seem to think that a smaller bid will actually make it quicker to get done back on the market. But sometimes that means the contractors sometimes focus on the bigger turns that will make them a little bit more money. So they put the smaller ones back on the back burner. And the larger ones, the higher quality bids, tend to move quickly because you have a different contractor with a different mindset of let's go in, let's get this done, let's make it pretty. I'm going to make a lot of money on this. They have a different mindset of a smaller one versus a bigger one. So sometimes it does move a little bit quicker when we're doing more work. And then ultimately that makes it rent faster, makes it more appealing to people.
So that whole time to turn piece, that TTT, that is just as critical from Brad Owens, our rehab and maintenance manager. That number is just as critical to him as it is to our property managers and the days on market number. Once we get owner approval to get something fixed, corrected, whatever, that's really when the time to turn starts. Hopefully we can get owner approval within, gosh, best case, I would say 3 to 4 days even of having a tenant move out. And obviously a large turn that needs paint and a bunch of other stuff is going to take longer than just a quick cleanup and so forth. And that all affects the numbers. But again, it's all about context, right? We have owners with a lot of older housing stock, where we operate, and those houses, they always need some upgrading. They always need some preventive maintenance done and so forth. It completely depends on the owner's goals, condition of the portfolio, and so forth. So it comes down to that whole individual owner's goals. What can we do to help them, and the context? But Gretchen, walk us through how you and Brad somehow touch every single vacant property that we have in the portfolio every week.
This is another report that we talk about once a week at our team meetings. It's called, it's AppFolio's Unit Vacancy Detail Report. So it'll pull everything that's vacant, whether it's rent ready or it just got moved out of. But we will pull that report and go through every single unit that's vacant. And we talk about, where are we at with this one? Okay, well, we just went through and changed the locks, working on the scope. Great. And then we make a note, follow up with it next week. Hey, last week we were at here, where are we at here? But we talk about who is doing the turn. Is the owner doing it themselves? Is it small enough or quick enough for us to do in-house with our maintenance people? Or is it a third party? But we discuss each one, and maybe some of the owners are holding it and, maybe they want to tackle it in the spring. So it's winterized, but we talk about every single one. And not only do we talk about what's being turned right now, but what's almost ready to go. That way, our property manager can reach out to the owner and start talking about the marketing details while it's in its final stages. So it cuts that time a little bit from rent ready to actually on the market.
Yeah. It's a big
Yeah,
part of the week.
Yeah, so we talked about how some smaller projects or smaller turns could be completed by the in-house team. So I want to talk a little bit about that in-house team and how maintenance in occupied homes, which is their main job, right? How does maintenance in occupied homes tie into profitability?
So when you have a happy, cheerful maintenance person who's very skilled and they go right in there and take care of a maintenance issue, it directly affects the tenant's happiness, right? I mean, if they call a work order in and someone comes in, they get it taken care of right away, they're happy. And it does eventually lead to potentially having that tenant sign a lease renewal. If they're happy, they're going to stay. And sometimes we talk to owners about, I'm kind of getting into lease renewals now, but if the maintenance person will go in and put a new ceiling fan in, it makes the tenant happy and they're more likely to sign there. And it kind of justifies that rent increase because that tenant knows that they're being taken care of. They're not just a number, they're actually important.
Property Meld, it's who we use for our maintenance platform, propertymeld.com. And, they will tell you, I don't have the exact statistics, but they actually have been able to show how much, and it's significant, how much a tenant who is satisfied with the maintenance team and have been happy with how their problems and concerns were addressed, that they absolutely will stay in the property longer. Whether it's signing an additional year or whatever lease, or it's a month-to-month fee and staying month to month. But that in-house maintenance thing it's made a huge difference in our business since we started working with Property Meld a couple of years ago. And thank goodness, our maintenance guys are the most skilled, happiest, friendliest bunch we've ever had. I mean, they're the reason, and we'll get to this as our last metric, why, our Google reviews are such as they are. It's because they have that one-on-one personal interaction with owners on a daily basis, and they're sending a terrific message. But as far as the metrics, right, we get a whole slate of metrics that the maintenance team and Gretchen go over. That meeting happens to be on Monday mornings, right, with the maintenance team.
Yep.
And, the metrics include, completed repairs overall, but it's also not just for the entire team, it's by the individual maintenance tech, right? And we get individual tenant satisfaction ratings for each maintenance tech through Property Meld. And those get plastered for 8 guys these days on the wall, right? If somebody drops below a 4, they're going to hear about it from everybody else in the room.
Oh, it's such a conversation Monday morning. So before we get into everything, we look at the board. Brad will put the numbers up. I'm looking at them. And Don has been going strong. 4.44 for the last 3 weeks. He dropped down to a 4.34, and the guys will never let him hear the end of it. And William bumped up by he went from 3 to a 1.47. And then the fun part about it is, yes, they'll give each other a hard time and they'll congratulate each other, but the winner always gets to pick what special treat I bring in for them on Monday during the meeting. It is a long meeting, and if we have cookies or a snack, it's much easier. But yeah, the winner always gets to pick. So they love it. I mean, it's a competition between them, and it's nice to see them. They really care about it.
We have metrics that drive the treat selection. See,
yes,
we have metrics for everything.
There are metrics for everything. I think that's a really fun point, and I think it's important because I think I mentioned in another podcast I recorded, Chris, about how when I came for Christmas with Roost, for the first time, I got to meet kind of the maintenance team and how happy they all were and how engaged and how like invested in Roost they were. They were like, it's like a family up there. And I said, we talk about how, higher renewal rates, fewer escalations, maintenance is really a retention strategy for owners, for the property manager. Roost, we really emphasize maintenance and it helps with Google reviews. And so that's advantageous to us. But I've never heard anybody talk about, maintenance technician retention. But I imagine that by tracking some of these metrics and by incentivizing them and by rewarding them, and even probably by, making fun of people who drop down a tenth of a point each week, that you're really creating kind of an environment for maintenance technicians to thrive too. And that probably really impacts retention of those folks, which has benefits obviously for Roost, but for the owners and for the tenants. I mean, what tenant doesn't want to see the same guy that they raved about on Google last time show up to fix the next thing? So I think that's a really interesting point that you make. But we talked about leasing, right? So let's go back to the leasing activity. Can you explain what Tenant Turner does when it comes to the leasing activity data?
Tenant Turner will give us real-time visibility of leasing. So we can see how many leads we had, we can see how many showings we had, if they didn't show up for the showings, feedback, they can provide, a 1 out of 5 rating, and then they can leave comments of the people who saw it. That's when they also automatically get an application. So it's pretty automated, but a lot of the times we go in too and we, talk with them, how can we make this better? Or, hey, we reduced the price, we can do this. But a lot of the metrics on there come from, there's a report you can pull of, again, how many leads, how many showings, how many no-shows, how many applications were sent. So we can see all those numbers in real time.
Yeah, we can see how it's performing online. We can see how the tenant turner boxes are working. It's this property meld has been a change for our business. Tenant turner was the second biggest change for our business, honestly, over the past 3 years or so, that we really started to understand how to use it and how to watch the metrics, right? So that we can make better decisions in a more timely manner, I guess, right? I think that's probably it. But, instead of waiting weeks to see whether something worked, we get immediate feedback from the market. So, that means that you and Taylor and Tina get to adjust the pricing, the messaging, the description. Having somebody who's looking at those numbers, those reports, those metrics on a daily basis definitely allows us to find and attract qualified applicants and get them approved within that 14-day window. And we're so deep into that on a daily basis. That's why it is such a red flag for us if something hits that 14 to 21 day spot where, okay, this didn't work. We've got an exception. What do we got to do to get this thing rented? So
it's another one of those tools, the technology that if you work with a property manager, then you have access to, that's probably a little cost prohibitive for folks, I would say, just managing a few properties to have on their own. So what does it do for the owners? You talked about how Tenant Turner changed things for Roost, but why is that important for owners?
Well, I think one of the coolest things, Gretchen, and maybe I'm missing something, but we've got it set that I think it's Sunday night, every owner who has a vacancy gets a recap that comes straight from Tenant Turner, unfiltered, about how their property performed over the course of the previous week. So, hopefully that we know it creates transparency. It creates a sense of urgency on our part. And, sometimes that sense of urgency comes from the owners. We like to think that we get more excited before they do, but there's no question. I think it shows that we're truly partners. We're not trying to hide anything. We want them to know that, we treat these properties as if they were our own. And somebody who's in charge of that particular process is going to be all over it. And Gretchen and Brad and me and Tina are going to make sure that they are. I don't know. I think at the end of the game, that's really what's in it for our owners, quite frankly.
Right. It's not just posted and forgotten.
That's right. Posted and forgotten. We don't want that.
We don't want that.
So we've mentioned a few times rent collection is another metric, right? And arguably that matters more than occupancy. Can you expand on that a little bit?
I think we beat occupancy and vacancy till it's pretty well dead for this podcast. But, occupancy is a snapshot in time. Rent collection is a financial reality, right? If a unit can be occupied and still not producing income, right? If you've got somebody in a unit and they're delinquent and they're not paying, that honestly is a far bigger problem than having a vacant unit that where nobody's supposed to be paying the rent. From an owner's perspective, and I speak from an owner and a Roost client, the only thing that matters is any given month is how much rent is actually collected. And that's why we track, rent due versus rent collected, and this is where our study of metrics and our use of metrics becomes very, very, very old school. And I have to say, I'm damn proud of it, right? So the best way that we can actually track whether or not the rent is collected or not is to focus on how many people didn't pay on time, right? How many 3-day notices did we have to go out and post this month? And how many of those people were we not able to chase down and cajole and so forth to get them to at least pay by the end of the month? Those very simple metrics, and there's really no technology that we've seen that substitutes for actually running, seeing, printing, and counting those 3-day notices. Gretchen, why don't you, I'm out of my pay grade here, I know, but why don't you just kind of talk about that for a little bit?
The rent collection. So we will, like you said, we'll print off those eviction notices. There's also a delinquency report in Appfolio, which will track not only rent, but other fees that are due, whether it's a month-to-month fee, a late fee, a pet fee, whatever it may be. But we try to track those down. I mean, we go knocking on doors, we will call and text and get all of those together. But I will say, we've seen there is certain times of the year that more people have trouble paying, around Christmas time is always tougher. But again, like we said, tax return time, everything kind of evens out. So we do our best to work with people that we can, but we do really, really track down. We really do work hard to get all that rent for the owner. And that is the most important thing for them.
Well, and for me, and Gretchen, she's actually in there deep, knowing exactly which house is which. But if I go back to my scorecard that I keep for us, and I look at how many 3-day notices we had to post last month, and let's say that number was 40, and I say, how are we doing this month? Because our first check run is the 10th, and that's the biggest check run. That's when our owners get paid. That's when we get paid. And I say to Gretchen, okay, how many 3 days did we have today? My first thing I'm going to do is going to go back and I'm going to look and see how were we last month? How were we the previous month? How were we in February of last year? Because if something's out of line from a seasonal perspective, we're going to have to dig deeper and find out why is it out of line? Where are we missing and so forth? And we're really lucky to have a couple of really great tenant relations specialists that are in our offices, Shannon and Marcy, and their primary focus from basically the 11th or 12th of the month all the way through till that last day and that last check run of the month is following up, cajoling, talking, trying to figure out what's happening with the rent, and just as important, right, if for whatever reason we can't collect, then it's the sense of urgency on our part is, okay, Mr. Owner, this has happened before. I think it's time that we suggest you cut your losses and let's go ahead and let this person leave or file the eviction if we need to file the eviction so that we can get somebody in there that's going to pay on time and even out your cash flow and help you sleep nights. But hopefully, if somebody hasn't paid by the 10th, it's always a surprise to us. It tends to be a surprise to the owner. But if we get to the point where we still haven't gotten paid by the 20th and we think that person's truly going to have to go, that means it's a phone call for Taylor, Tina, or Gretchen with that owner to talk through, this is probably the time to, actually file the court papers and evict this person. The point is, if we're not all over those 3-day notices, if we're not all over delinquencies and so forth, it's super easy for somebody who hasn't paid to slip through another month, right? And our goal is if we're going to file the eviction, we want to get it filed this month so that we can get custody of that house back as fast as we possibly can and not lose another month's rent because we were 3 or 4 days late on the calendar.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example of how, the occupancy rate can be misleading and how it could give false confidence, right? And if you have 100% occupancy rate, but nobody's paying, then you really shouldn't feel great about that, right? So it changes the way we behave on behalf of the owners. So on the other side of the coin, we have renewals and forward planning. So Roost starts renewal discussions pretty early. Talk to me about why we do that.
Well, before we do that, there is a metric to this, right? And the metric is for whatever given period of time, whether it's a month or the year, what percentage of the tenants, there's actually a couple of different metrics. It's what percentage of them move out and go month to month, what percentage of them sign another lease, and what percentage of them leave, right? So there's really three possibilities at the end of a lease term, and we have metrics for each one. But what I really want Gretchen to kind of walk us through is, part of those reports that we get these numbers on, we can sort of look ahead, and when it comes to renewals, which leads to, what should the rent be going forward, and how do we help an owner plan for managing their portfolio, what they can expect over the next months, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. This kind of gets me excited, and it's going to bore everybody to death. So Gretchen, tell us, why do we start the renewal process so early?
So our goal is about 120 days out. And we do that because a lot of owners would like us, and we need to too, walk the units. Is it being taken care of? Are there things that we need to do to justify a rent increase? Do we need to research the market? Are we at market rent now? Do we need to increase it a little bit? Can we offer a 1, 2 year lease, whatever it may be? A lot of it, though, I think, like I said before, is if maintenance goes in there, walks the property, yes, they're taking care of it, it's great, but they said, this door, leaks air, da da da, whatever it may be. And if that tenant is taken care of with the maintenance issue, in 20 days or so, when they get that renewal, they're more likely to sign it and feel better about a rent adjustment because they know they're taken care of. So it gives us time to kind of get those things in order.
The other thing that 120 days does is, and again, this is really important, I think, for owners that have multiple properties, is I think it gives you, Tina, Taylor, time to schedule quality one-on-one with that owner.
Yeah.
And if they have more than one property, look at the calendar. When does the next renewal come up for this property, and this property? And sometimes it's nice to be able to look ahead and make sure that we're aligned with the owner expectations, right? If the owner thinks that, this property, it can go both ways, right? Maybe they think the property is worth more than what the market will dictate, but maybe they think less. And, just to be able to go through and say, well, here's where the market is on this one. We think you should push this one up. And sometimes it's a conversation of, well, if you had a brand new tenant, you might be able to get X, but this tenant's been great for the past 3 years. Maybe you want X minus Y, whatever. Maybe you want to make a bit of a concession to optimum market rate in order to keep this tenant in place and avoid lost rent and the potential turn, et cetera, et cetera. So getting enough time out to have a calm, thoughtful conversation with an owner about where that property is going to be, or where all their properties could conceivably be rent-wise over the course of the next year, and what they may have to invest to get to those numbers. That to me is the magic of starting renewal processes 120 days out, because I think that shows where we really are a partner in that owner's success. And it's just so easy to get caught up in the day to day to day. And then suddenly you've got the end of a lease coming up next week, and I got to talk to you about getting the rent raised. We're out of time.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that. We don't like that. The owner hates that. It doesn't feel like a partnership. It feels like a task, and we just want to avoid that. So, that report that shows what's coming up for renewal over the next few months, and then being able to calculate exactly what the percentages are so we can advise owners accordingly. In this market, in this price range, a third of the people will go month to month, a third of the people will sign a new lease, and a third of the people will move out. I'm throwing that out there. I'm probably close, but I'm throwing that out there. But to know that by market and to be able to have that discussion and to help lead the owner to making the decision that's right for them, that really is our job. We can't just be quote property managers. We've got to be partners with those owners and asset managers, in some cases in portfolio management when they have multiple properties.
I think this is where you can see a really big difference between self-managing and working with a property manager. I think a lot from my experience, Nana. I just think that it's more of an innocent until proven guilty scenario with renewals. Like they're gonna renew until they don't. And so then what happens? Then you're put into this renewal might not be the best thing for your tenant. It might not be the best thing for the property owner themselves. So having time to work through that and just knowing that it's part of the overall strategy, that somebody's paying attention to it before it just happens, because then, you're stuck. I know that my family's had to make a lot of decisions at the very last minute because somebody moved out when they just assumed that they were going to renew. They didn't really talk to them about it beforehand. And then you're stuck with a vacant property and decisions to make about whether you're going to rehab it, whether you're just going to do a quick turn. Are there any contractors available to do the rehab you had planned to do between tenants? And then you're stuck figuring out what the rent should be based on all of this math. So I think that just working with somebody who has a strategy around renewals and treats it as a smaller part of a much bigger picture is huge. And I see a big difference for people who are self-managing versus working with a property manager who also has that bigger picture data, right? So one of the things that's really becoming clear to me about this is when you work with data and metrics, sample size matters, right? If you have 10 properties, that's great. You can compare what this property is doing to that property. But if you work with a property manager that has hundreds of properties, then they're far more likely to see those trends earlier. They're far more likely to identify, based on what is happening with other properties, they can apply that to your properties and how they're able to rent them faster or save money on turns or, get more renewals or, the whole nine. So that's really what's kind of become clear to me throughout this conversation is that sample size matters and kind of working with a property manager helps to, speed up some of these, I won't want to say mistakes, but some of these processes and to apply other successes to your properties as, those things come up with your properties is huge. But let's talk, we mentioned earlier about Google reviews and culture. And, a lot of companies, I don't think include these type of culture metrics in their overall metrics that they share with folks. Why does Roost focus so intently on that? And why do we track Google reviews as a core metric?
I guess I'll start off. And I'll preface this by saying, and we've talked about this before in previous podcasts, there were years and years and years where I paid no attention to Google reviews, and that was just dumb. And it was just in the last couple of years, Lacey, with your help, that we kind of got a handle on what was happening there and how it worked and how it met. But Google reviews matter, and we prefer Google reviews to any other because Google isn't pay for play, right? It's not like Yelp or Better Business Bureau where you pay money, to the platform and so forth. Google just is what it is, and it reflects lived experience. It captures how residents and owners actually feel about communication, maintenance, and service, and that is a powerful accountability tool. Now, do we have maybe 1-2% on a bad month of people who are just out to lash out, hurt us, or hurt anybody? Yes, but that does not in any way diminish the fact that 99% of what happens on Google reviews is valid and again reflects lived experience. So for us, it's a critical part of how we've learned to run the business the past 2 or 3 years.
We ask a very specific question at the end of interactions in order to kind of gauge where we are and hopefully before a Google review. But we asked, have I earned a 5-star review today? Why do we ask it in that very specific way?
Well,
Because otherwise we would not get a 5-star review.
Hey, can I have a 3-star review today?
Can I have a
Did I get
3-star review? I
Gretchen,
don't
didn't
feel
you
great about the service
ask
I
somebody
provided
for a
today.
review and they gave you 4 stars? Because we talked about how 4 stars used to be like the max stars. It was like 2 thumbs up. You don't have more than 2 thumbs. And like back when 4 stars was like a great review, but like you got a 4-star review instead of 5 because you didn't specifically ask for it. And they were thrilled. Their Google review was, we are thrilled with the service. It's fantastic, but somehow it was only 4 stars.
Well, I mean, we always ask the question, and we ask all of our folks, have I earned a 5-star review today? It frames the service as intentional. It reminds the team that every interaction matters. But that's also why, when you go check us out on Google, I think we're running a 4.7 or a 4.8. I think Columbus might be a 4.7 or a 4.8, and Springfield might be the other one. But what you're going to see is tons and tons and tons of 5-star reviews and then a smattering of 1-star reviews. I don't believe we have ever had maybe a handful of reviews that were 2 or 3. It tends to be 5 or 1 thumbs up or thumb down, but that's where you really have to go in because, and again, this goes back to the quality and the orientation of the maintenance guys. There's always words next to those, 5-star reviews, right? And they'll say something nice or what they appreciated, and that's valid feedback regardless. But you know, Gretchen hates it when we get a 1-star review because I can't handle it. It freaks me out. And when we do receive negative reviews or a 1-star review, we do the best we possibly can to respond quickly and absolutely honestly. And usually the team knows who the disgruntled tenants are, for whatever reason. In many cases, it's because they haven't paid the rent and they're hearing from us about when they're going to pay, or maybe they've already had an eviction filed, or it could be any number of reasons. But if there is any place, any grain of truth, and that's not even the right word, if there's any sense in any less than 5-star review that we didn't live up to our obligation to that owner or tenant, I really believe that we do the best we possibly can when we're wrong to say we're wrong and say how we either already fixed it or we're going to fix it. If the review is inaccurate, we're going to explain why it's inaccurate. We're not going to just say, yeah, we're sorry we screwed up if we didn't screw up, and again, sometimes you have people, you don't know what's going on in their lives and so forth, but they lash out. The other thing that we've had happen is sometimes the 1-star reviews are not coming from anybody who's on the lease, but which is a whole nother issue in and of itself. But if that's the case, and we don't have any history with this person or even with the person who's on the lease, we're going to respond and say that. So if we did something wrong, you're going to see it. We're going to say exactly what we need to do about it. We're going to encourage them to call Gretchen directly if that's where it needs to go. And, we're going to be transparent. We're going to be embarrassed. We're going to get it out there, but we're never, ever going to let a single star or a less than 5-star review go unanswered. And I think focusing on that metric, that 4.7, 4.8, and actually in Florida, I think we've got like 40 or 55-star reviews now for Reno, which is just fantastic. But we get super excited when we get the 5 stars, but there's a 5-alarm fire drill when a 1-star comes through. And Gretchen, sadly, is always on the other end of that conversation.
But you're right. Most of the time, we know exactly the situation and we just respond appropriately. Either we're wrong or
you're wrong.
Explain what happened. Yeah, I wasn't going to say it like that, but yeah, you're wrong or we're wrong.
Well, it's not even so much you're wrong, but we do use an opportunity to say what we did right because we want any owner who's checking us out, current or future owner, to say, oh, well, that makes perfect sense. I don't know what else I would have done. If I was doing this myself, that's what I would have done.
Yeah.
That's a lot of math, a lot of numbers.
Transparency builds trust over time, right? So just being transparent with folks and letting people know, good, bad, or otherwise, that you're going to tell the truth about it and be upfront about it. I think is what builds trust. I think this is also another scenario where it's a kind of a chicken and egg, where we talked about, the maintenance technicians and how having those metrics impacts their performance. I think, knowing that you're going to come into the office or go out into the field and do your job and then ask, have I earned a 5-star review today, sets the mindset and the tone and, your intentions for the job that you're about to do. So I think that's a really important part of the process. And the data at that point kind of impacts the data in a very cyclical way.
Yeah.
So I think that's something
Well,
that not everybody has.
and the Google reviews are independent of the property mill reviews. So if a maintenance tech goes in and it didn't go well, right, or they couldn't fix it, or the tenant was very upset or whatever, they're probably not going to ask that tenant for a 5-star review, but that tenant is still going to get a text message asking them to rate the performance of that tech. Google reviews are a completely separate metric that tells in some much larger story really than even the property mill numbers do. So. Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of companies, and maybe there was some of this initially, Chris, before we got Google reviews set up, there's a fear there. What are people going to say? And then you can't change it, right? Like that, this is a very transparent
oh
process
yeah,
that
you
Google
can't make
has, and
Google
you can't
reviews
make it
go
go
away.
away.
No.
You can't change it. So the what ifs can be overwhelming, I think, if you have a fear of how your technicians or your people on the phone or your leasing managers are performing. So I think that just having it in place and putting such an emphasis on it says a lot about the confidence that you have in Roost, that we all have in our processes and our services and the intentions of everybody and capabilities of everyone who works at Roost. We're not afraid to ask the question. We're not afraid to put that out there. We want people to see, because we've worked really hard to make this an enjoyable experience for everyone involved, and we're happy to show that.
Well, let's tie this up today. So when you step back and you look at all of this together, the point is not that Roost tracks more metrics than any other property management company, because I guarantee you we don't. But the point is that we strive to track the right metrics consistently, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. We don't have any metrics of the moment, right? If it's not something that is a number that's going to assist with profitability for the next 25 years, then we're likely not going to count it. Metrics should always help owners and managers make better decisions. They should create clarity, not confusion. They should separate what can be influenced from what cannot. And they should reflect how real portfolios actually operate in the real world. When metrics ignore context, everybody loses. Owners will start to get misleading information. Managers will get evaluated on outcomes they can't control. Decisions get delayed or made for the wrong reasons, and this erodes trust and it erodes landlord profitability. So we really strive to look at metrics that, do the opposite of that. Ours hopefully focus on, attention on the leasing performance, the maintenance execution. We look at cash flow, we look at renewal planning, communication, everything that we look at. It always consciously is aligned with what our long-term outcomes are for our owners and in turn our company. And that makes that partnership between the owner and our company hopefully visible, measurable, and shows some attention. So whether somebody has a single property, 50 properties, 150 property, I think the same principles apply. It just means that the metrics might be a little different for each group. So anything that we might have missed today, Gretchen, Lacey? We hit a lot today. This was a
We
long
hit a
episode.
lot. I think we got it.
As the resident nerd who loves all of this, I think we did a great job.
Well, if anybody listening out there wants a full breakdown of the metrics we track and why, we're about to publish a detailed post that will be in the show notes after we get this podcast out to the world that walks through everything we discussed today. So again, that link will be in the show notes. And if you're evaluating a property management partner and want one that measures what matters and manages with intention, and you happen to be in Ohio or Florida, we would love to talk to you. So that's my shameless plug for the day, ladies. All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for listening. We appreciate it.